In the aftermath, while the council continued to churn with arguments, Rhaegar decided to engage in a different sort of diplomacy. He hosted a tourney on the fields outside King's Landing, a grand event meant to bring lords, knights, and common folk together in celebration. The war had ended abruptly, and no victory feast had ever truly been held. Now, with so many lords gathered, Rhaegar hoped a display of chivalry and sport might ease tensions more than dry debates could. The day of the tourney dawned bright, banners snapping in the wind. The field was laid out with wooden fences for the jousting lists, surrounded by tiered stands for spectators. Merchants hawked sweetmeats and ale, and minstrels roved among the crowd. Knights from every corner of the realm signed up for the justs and melees, eager to prove themselves and perhaps win favor from the king. Even some lords entered the lists, including Oberyn Martell, renowned for his deadly skill with the spear, and Loras Tyrell, a young but gifted juster. Robert Baratheon, of course, made a flamboyant entrance, brandishing his massive warhammer, though tourney rules required a blunted version if he wished to compete. He roared with laughter, reminding men that he had once faced Rhaegar on the battlefield by the trident. For some, the memory of that near-duel sparked old resentments, but Robert seemed content to drown those feelings in strong drink and boisterous jokes. When the justs began, the stands erupted in cheers and gasps. Lance tips splintered on shields and breastplates, and riders thundered down the lists with deadly focus. The king watched from a modest dais, Queen Elia at his side. Princes Rhaenys and Aegon sat behind them, marveling at the spectacle. Rhaegar himself wore a formal black mantle embroidered with a three-headed dragon in silver thread. He smiled politely, applauded skillful tilts, and exchanged murmured observations with Elia and Barristan Selmy. Everyone waited to see if the king would ride in the lists. In his younger days, Rhaegar had proved himself an accomplished juster, more than capable of defeating renowned knights. Yet rumor held that since taking the throne, and since the tragedy with Aerys, he had lost his taste for the public display of martial prowess. As the jousting continued, lords whispered, some half expecting the king to declare himself. But Rhaegar did not. He quietly declined, content to observe. His armor, inlaid with rubies, remained stored away. He had no desire to revisit the battlefield's illusions of glory. The war had taught him how swiftly glory could turn to horror. So he watched as Loras Tyrell unhorsed a pair of talented knights in quick succession, earning cheers from the crowd. Oberyn Martell competed in the melee, wielding a spear with lethal grace. Then, surprisingly, Robert Baratheon demanded a tilt as well, substituting a heavy lance for his warhammer. He shouted challenges, pride still stoked by older glories. The crowd tensed when Robert rode against a knight in plain, blackened armor, Ser Brynden Tully, the Blackfish, who had entered the lists on a whim. The clash was tremendous, each man leaning into the charge. Robert's physical power propelled his lance in a punishing blow, but Ser Brynden managed to maintain his seat, albeit barely. In the second pass, the Blackfish struck Robert's shield directly in the center, splintering both shield and lance into shards. Robert toppled to the ground, landing heavily in the dirt. A stunned hush fell. Then, after a moment, Robert roared with laughter. He rolled to his feet, dusting himself off, and bellowed, "Well struck, Tully! Next time, I'll bring my hammer, and we'll see who stands." The crowd roared with approval, enjoying Robert's good humor. Even Rhaegar found himself smiling slightly. He could see that Robert, despite his bitterness, still possessed a spirit that could be magnanimous when not clouded by vengeance. Perhaps there was hope yet for a realm that could contain both Targaryen and Baratheon pride. As the day wore on, the tourney concluded with Loras Tyrell claiming victory in the justs, a triumph that made the Reachmen jubilant. Oberyn Martell emerged as the last man standing in the melee, drawing cheers from the Dornish and raising some eyebrows at the lethal efficiency of his combat style. When the ceremony for awarding prizes arrived, King Rhaegar presented golden wreaths to the victors, commending their valor. Loras knelt with respectful elegance, while Oberyn took his prize with a sardonic smile, his eyes reflecting both pride and lingering resentment toward the Targaryen name. That evening, A feast was held in the great hall of the Red Keep. Long tables were laden with roasted boar, fresh bread, honeyed fruits, and numerous flagons of wine. Minstrels played lively tunes, and dancers wove between the tables. Laughter filled the air, though it was occasionally strained, as lords attempted to bury ancient grudges beneath the merriment. Rhaegar made a point of toasting the honor of the knights who had competed. His words were gracious, tactful, and free of arrogance. Still, beneath the music and laughter, tensions and conspiracies churned. At one table, men from House Bolton drank in silence, eyes ever watchful for potential advantage. At another, Lannister courtiers whispered of future expansions to the west. Around the hall, one could see subtle alliances forming or fracturing in the swirl of conversation. Late in the evening, as the feast's energy began to wane, Rhaegar slipped away from the high table. Elia noticed but did not stop him. She understood her husband sometimes needed a moment alone from the demands of kingship. He meandered through a side passage, eventually finding himself on a terrace overlooking the Red Keep's outer walls. The night sky stretched vast and dark above the city, flickering torchlight marking the lines of the streets below. He stood there, letting the cool breeze wash over him. The day had been a success by most measures. The lords had enjoyed the tourney, and no blood had been spilled. Yet he knew this was but a temporary balm. The realm's fractures ran deep, and it would take more than justs and feasts to truly unite the Seven Kingdoms. If anything, the illusions of unity might prompt dangerous men to bide their time, waiting for a moment of weakness to strike. A soft footstep approached behind him. He turned to see Jaime Lannister, resplendent in his white Kingsguard cloak and gilded armor. Jaime inclined his head, golden hair catching the torchlight. "Your Grace," he said, "I noticed you'd left the feast." Rhaegar studied the young knight's face. Jaime had once served as the Mad King's sworn protector, a duty that had burdened him with a bitter guilt. These days, he seemed uneasy, caught between loyalty to House Lannister and his oath to defend King Rhaegar. "I needed a breath of air, Sir Jaime," Rhaegar said softly. "But you needn't follow me like a shadow." Jaime offered a wry smile. "A Kingsguard has but one duty. I'd rather stand guard in the fresh air than watch men gorge themselves in the hall." He paused, glancing at the city lights. "Is this what you hoped for? A realm where these lords pretend to like each other while their blades remain half-drawn?" "There are worse realms," Rhaegar replied. He clasped his hands behind his back. "And yes, I did hope for something like this, because the alternative was rivers of blood." Jaime nodded, gaze drifting. "I suppose so. You did the unthinkable to stop your father. But I wonder, can you ever truly escape what it cost you?" Rhaegar's jaw tightened slightly. "No," he admitted. "The realm may not speak of it openly, but I feel it every day. I ended Aerys' tyranny, but I also ended his life by my own hand. Some will see that as an act of heroism. Others will see it as the greatest taboo. And I will always carry the memory of that night." A lull settled in, the hush of unspoken regrets. At length, Jaime cleared his throat and said, "The small folk call you the Harpist King. They say you once loved music more than battle. Do you ever regret taking up the sword?" Rhaegar looked back at the blazing city. "At times. But I've learned that a king who cannot wield a sword when necessary invites others to wield it for him, and often that leads to horrors. I still play my harp when I can, though rarely. Someday, if the realm finds true peace, perhaps I will have time to compose new songs. But for now, my life belongs to the throne and to the people." Jaime studied him for a moment, then said, "I hope that day comes, Your Grace." Without another word, he retreated into the darkness of the corridor, leaving Rhaegar alone with his thoughts. As the Great Council sessions dragged into weeks, then months, progress was made and progress was stymied in roughly equal measure. A set of proposed laws emerged, tentative but significant. They clarified limits on royal authority, codified how the crown should address the faith, and offered guidelines for inheritance when lines became tangled. The crown's promise to send assistance to war-torn regions was made official, with Tywin Lannister orchestrating how much coin the royal coffers could spare. At every turn, Rhaegar labored to ensure no single faction walked away feeling entirely defeated, lest the alliances unravel. Outside the formal sessions, the lords convened in smaller gatherings, forging private agreements. Some of these were honorable bargains, sealed with handshakes and communal feasting. Others were shadowy affairs, bartered in whispers behind locked doors. Spies skittered through the halls. Rhaegar was no fool. He knew betrayal could sprout anywhere, but he hoped the mere presence of so many watchers and the memory of recent war might deter the most blatant plots. To his relief, Robert Baratheon seemed disinclined to spark new conflict. Though his underlying bitterness remained, he expended most of his energy on drinking, carousing, and occasionally competing in friendly wrestling matches with other warriors. People whispered that the great fury that once drove Robert had faded, leaving him rudderless. More and more, he left the political matters to Ned Stark and Jon Arryn, content to posture as a warrior of renown without pressing for the throne that had once seemed within his grasp. One evening, well after midnight, Eddard Stark paid a surprise visit to Rhaegar's Solar, accompanied by Jon Arryn. Rhaegar was reviewing some scrolls by candlelight, stifling a yawn, when the two men were shown in. He rose, offering them seats. "My lords, is something amiss?" Ned's expression was grim. "We've heard disturbing rumors, whispers that certain bannermen loyal to the memory of your father may be conspiring to avenge him. We're not sure how credible these rumors are, but they speak of a plan to reignite the war by inciting lesser lords in the Stormlands and the Westerlands." Jon Arryn nodded solemnly. "We came to you first in confidence because naming these conspirators publicly could cause a panic if we're wrong. But if we're right, they may be a threat to the peace you've built." Rhaegar's stomach tightened. Of course, it would not be so simple. The longer the peace lasted, the more certain fanatics on either side would see it as betrayal of old loyalties. "Do we have names?" Ned shook his head. "Only hints. A certain Lord Caron in the Stormlands, perhaps. A minor Lannister cousin with a taste for vengeance. Others too, but we lack proof. I suspect they're disgruntled knights who preferred Aerys' tyranny because it let them indulge in cruelty unchecked." Rhaegar ran a hand through his silver hair. "We must root this out carefully. If we march openly on those suspected, they'll disappear like shadows. If we do nothing, they might strike." He eyed Jon Arryn. "Lord Arryn, do you have loyal men who can investigate quietly?" "I do," Jon replied. "I'll dispatch them at once. Quiet inquiries, no accusations until we're certain." Rhaegar nodded. "And I'll ask Ser Barristan to enhance security around the Red Keep. We won't give these conspirators an easy target. Thank you both for coming to me." Jon Arryn regarded him steadily. "We remember what Aerys did to my foster son's father and brother. We won't let such madness return if we can stop it. You have my support, Your Grace." Their quiet meeting ended, leaving Rhaegar troubled but determined. He had known peace would be fragile. If these rebels to the rebels, men who still worshipped the memory of the Mad King, were indeed plotting, then the realm was in more danger than the lords at the Great Council realized. Better, he thought, to handle it quietly, without rousing a panic that might lead to renewed violence. Meanwhile, beyond the politics, life carried on in King's Landing. Midwives delivered children, merchants haggled over prices, and the city guard tried to keep the peace among the throng of travelers. Queen Elia worked tirelessly with the royal household to distribute food to the poor, a tradition she had begun during the final days of the war when starvation loomed. Her kindness earned her a beloved reputation among the common folk, though some courtiers sneered that she was trying to buy loyalty for House Martell. Rhaegar disregarded such cynicism. He saw that his wife was trying to ameliorate real suffering in the capital, and he respected her unwavering compassion. One morning, a raven arrived from Winterfell. Ned Stark, busy with council duties in King's Landing, had left behind certain northern lords to tend Winterfell. The letter reported a harsh early frost in the far north, along with an unusual sighting. Some travelers claimed to have seen pale creatures skulking beyond the wall. The Maester of Winterfell dismissed the accounts as illusions conjured by swirling snow and fear, But the letter's tone was uneasy. Rhaegar, reading it in the quiet of his solar, felt a chill prickle down his spine. Was it just another northern ghost story, or evidence that something ancient was stirring? He placed the letter aside and closed his eyes for a moment, recalling the words of prophecy that had once driven him to extremes. The dragon has 3 heads, he had read. The prince that was promised. The coming of the long night. He had once believed wholeheartedly that he was destined to unite the realm against a darkness from the far north. Yet all the prophecy in the world did not change the grinding reality of daily governance. Perhaps destiny alone could not triumph without a realm prepared to face it. And so the Great Council continued. Debates over taxes, over the balance of power between crown and lords, over the duties of wardship and fostering, and 1,000 other details wove a tapestry of compromise. Tywin Lannister's iron sense of order shaped the financial and administrative proposals, sometimes clashing with the more lenient impulses of Rhaegar's loyalists. Dornish delegates insisted on recognition of their traditions in inheritance law, refusing to yield on certain points. The Tyrells demanded rights to expand trade routes with Old Town and beyond. Robert Baratheon sulked through many of these sessions, but occasionally voiced loud approval for any measure that lessened the crown's interference in local governance. Eventually, a workable framework emerged. It was far from perfect, but it provided guidelines that might, if adhered to, prevent future tyrants from trampling their vassals' rights without consequence. It also guaranteed certain privileges to each region, symbolically acknowledging that the Targaryens could not rule by fear alone. Finally, the council agreed upon an official condemnation of the atrocities of Aerys II's reign. An unprecedented statement, given that he had once been the crowned king. In it, they cited the murders of Rhaegar and Brandon Stark, the cruel threat of wildfire, and various abuses of power. This final measure was more symbolic than legal, but it was the realm's way of drawing a line between the Mad King's memory and the new monarchy. The day came for the council's final session, where the lords would affix their seals to the new statutes, binding themselves and their heirs. The throne room was packed from wall to wall, tense and expectant. Rhaegar arrived in solemn attire, accompanied by Queen Elia and their children, along with the Kingsguard. Tywin Lannister stood at the foot of the dais, the official scribe and architect of much of the wording. One by one, major lords were called to sign or to place their seal upon the thick parchments enumerating the new laws. Eddard Stark strode forward in plain northern garb, pressing his direwolf seal into the wax. Jon Arryn followed, stamping his falcon and moon. Robert Baratheon took the quill with a scowl, scrawling his name and pressing the flaming heart of House Baratheon's signet ring into the wax. Mace Tyrell and Oberyn Martell likewise sealed the deal, though Oberyn held Rhaegar's gaze a little longer than most, as if reminding him that Dorne would be watching. When it was done, Tywin Lannister passed the parchments to Rhaegar. The king took a deep breath. He glanced over at Ser Barristan, at Jaime Lannister, at Elia, who watched him with quiet pride. Then he signed his name, Rhaegar of the House Targaryen, second of his name, King of the Undulls and the Rhoynar and the First Men, Lord of the Seven Kingdoms and Protector of the Realm, and pressed the Targaryen seal into the wax, the 3-headed dragon imprint joining the others. A hush lingered. Then Rhaegar rose. "Lords of Westeros," he said, his voice carrying through the hall. "You have signed these statutes of your own will. Let them guide us, protect us, and remind us that we stand stronger together than apart. May the horrors of war not soon visit us again." A ragged cheer went up from some corners, applause from others. Not all were enthusiastic, but few dared openly object. It was done. The Great Council had concluded in a measure of unity scarcely seen since the days of Aegon the Conqueror. As lords began to file out, some eager to return to their own lands, a measure of guarded optimism filled the capital. Perhaps, for all the hidden resentments, a lasting peace could be forged. Rhaegar and Elia received congratulatory visits from foreign envoys, from bravos, pentos, and even a small contingent from the Summer Isles. Trade treaties might follow, new alliances might flourish. The future was not guaranteed, but it was open in a way it had never seemed under Aerys's reign. Yet in a shadowed corner of the Red Keep, danger coalesced. The conspirators Ned Stark had warned Rhaegar about had not been idle. Spurned Targaryen loyalists, or more accurately, loyalists to Aerys's brutal vision, had found each other during the Great Council. They saw Rhaegar's compromises as betrayals of true Targaryen power. While the king and his lords congratulated themselves on forging a new realm, these men plotted a dramatic act that would reignite the war and avenge the Mad King. A plan was taking shape, a sudden strike at the king or his family, or perhaps unleashing a hidden cache of wildfire left undiscovered beneath the city. They whispered in secret chambers, forging alliances with disaffected knights, stashing weapons, and writing coded letters to potential allies in the countryside.